Some discoveries change everything in a single heartbeat. On a snow-covered Christmas Eve in 1987, when the world felt frozen in time and hope seemed as distant as spring, a man's simple act of checking on his livestock would unravel a mystery that had haunted his small farming community for months. What he found huddled in the corner of his old hay barn wasn't just a person seeking shelter from the bitter cold. It was a revelation that would expose secrets, heal old wounds, and remind everyone that miracles sometimes come disguised as the most unexpected encounters. This is the story of how one Christmas Eve discovery in a forgotten hayloft would connect two strangers, bridge decades of silence, and prove that sometimes the most profound gifts arrive when we least expect them and need them most. The wind howled through the bare branches of the old oak trees that lined Thomas McKenna's property, carrying with it the sharp bite of approaching snow. December 24th, 1987, had arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made even the hardiest farmers in Millbrook County think twice about venturing outside after dark. Thomas pulled his worn wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way across the frozen ground toward the old hay barn that sat at the edge of his property. At 62, Thomas had been farming this land for nearly 4 decades, and he knew every sound, every shadow, every subtle change that came with the seasons. Tonight felt different, though. There was something in the air beyond just the promise of snow, a heaviness that seemed to press down on everything, making even familiar spaces feel strange and unwelcoming. The beam from his flashlight cut through the darkness as he approached the weathered barn doors. The structure had seen better days, with gaps between the wooden slats that let in winter drafts and a roof that occasionally leaked during heavy rains. Thomas had been meaning to tear it down for years, but somehow he never got around to it. The barn held too many memories of better times, when his wife Sarah was still alive, and their children would play hide-and-seek among the hay bales during summer afternoons. He pulled open the heavy wooden door, and the familiar smell of dried grass and old wood filled his nostrils. The interior was mostly empty now, just a few bales of hay stacked in the far corner and some old farming equipment that he rarely used anymore. Thomas swept his flashlight across the interior, checking for any signs of animals that might have sought shelter from the cold. It was then that he heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the hayloft above. Thomas paused, listening carefully. It could have been mice, or perhaps a stray cat that had found its way inside. But as he stood there in the silence, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of someone trying very hard not to make any noise at all. Someone was up there, hiding in his hayloft. His first instinct was to call out, to demand that whoever was trespassing on his property show themselves immediately. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way the sound had seemed so desperate, so careful, like whoever was up there was more afraid than he was. Thomas had lived through enough winters in rural Pennsylvania to know that sometimes people did desperate things when they had nowhere else to go. Instead of shouting, he quietly made his way to the wooden ladder that led up to the loft. Each rung creaked under his weight, and he winced with every sound, not wanting to startle whoever was hiding above. As his head cleared the floor of the loft, he swept his flashlight slowly across the scattered hay. There, huddled in the far corner beneath an old horse blanket, was a figure so still and small that Thomas almost missed it entirely. The blanket rose and fell with shallow, rapid breathing, and he could see a pair of worn boots sticking out from underneath. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "I know you're there," he said softly, trying to keep his voice calm and non-threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you all right?" The blanket shifted slightly, but whoever was underneath made no move to reveal themselves. Thomas waited patiently, remembering how his own children used to hide when they were frightened, how patience and kindness could coax them out better than any amount of demanding or threatening. "It's Christmas Eve," he continued, climbing the rest of the way into the loft and settling himself a respectful distance away from the huddled figure. "Pretty cold night to be sleeping in a barn. You must be freezing." Finally, slowly, the blanket was pulled back to reveal a face that Thomas would never forget for the rest of his life. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, with dark hair that hung in tangled strands around her shoulders. The face was thin and drawn, marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a kind of haunted weariness that spoke of experiences Thomas could only imagine. But it was her eyes that struck him most. They were the brightest blue he had ever seen, even in the dim light of his flashlight, and they held a mixture of fear and desperate hope that made his heart ache. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "I know I shouldn't be here. I'll leave right away. I just needed somewhere warm for the night." Thomas studied her face more closely, something nagging at the back of his mind. There was something familiar about her features, something that reminded him of someone, though he couldn't quite place it. She was clearly malnourished and exhausted, her clothes dirty and worn thin. A small backpack sat beside her, apparently containing all her worldly possessions. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently, settling himself more comfortably on the hay-covered floor of the loft. The woman hesitated, as if even sharing her name was a risk she wasn't sure she could take. "Elizabeth," she said finally. "Elizabeth Warren." Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Warren. That name meant something in Millbrook County, something important. But the connection was dancing just out of reach in his mind, like a word on the tip of his tongue that wouldn't quite form. "Well, Elizabeth Warren," he said. "I'm Thomas McKenna, and this is my barn you're taking shelter in. And I have to say, you've picked quite a night to be without a proper roof over your head." Elizabeth pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her eyes never leaving his face. She was clearly trying to gauge whether this older farmer posed a threat or might be someone who could help her. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the desperate need for help warring with whatever had taught her to be so cautious around strangers. "I have money," she said quickly, reaching for her backpack. "Not much, but I can pay you for letting me stay here tonight. I'll be gone first thing in the morning, I promise." Thomas held up a hand to stop her from digging through her belongings. "Put your money away," he said firmly. "No charge for basic human decency, especially not on Christmas Eve."
For the first time since revealing herself, Elizabeth's expression softened slightly.
A tear rolled down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. "You don't understand," she said. "I can't. There are people looking for me. Bad people. If they find me here, it could cause trouble for you too." Thomas leaned back against a hay bale, his mind working through this new information. A woman alone, hiding, afraid of being found by bad people. He had lived long enough to know that there were usually two sides to every story, but something about Elizabeth's demeanor convinced him that her fear was genuine. "How long have you been on the road?" he asked. 3 weeks, Elizabeth replied without hesitation, as if she had been counting every day. "Maybe longer. Time kind of blends together when you're living like this." Thomas noticed how she had started to say something else before catching herself. Whatever her story was, she wasn't ready to share the full truth yet. That was all right. He had learned patience from 4 decades of farming. Some things couldn't be rushed, whether they were crops growing in the field or trust growing between strangers. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Elizabeth's stomach chose that moment to rumble audibly, answering his question before she could. She blushed and nodded, looking embarrassed by her body's betrayal. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" "Yesterday, I think. Maybe the day before." Elizabeth's voice was getting stronger now, though she still kept the blanket pulled up around her shoulders. "I had some crackers and an apple I bought at a gas station." Thomas stood up slowly, his knees protesting the movement. "Well, that settles it then. You're coming up to the house with me." Elizabeth's eyes widened in alarm. "Oh no, I couldn't. I don't want to impose, and like I said, it might not be safe." "Elizabeth," Thomas interrupted gently, "it's Christmas Eve. I've got a pot of soup on the stove that's too big for one person, and a warm house that's too quiet for comfort. Now, you can either come with me willingly, or I can stand here all night trying to convince you while we both freeze to death in this barn. Either way, you're getting a hot meal tonight." There was something in his tone, firm but kind, with just a hint of the authority he had used when raising his own children, that seemed to reach Elizabeth in a way that gentle persuasion had not. She looked into his weathered face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden motive, and apparently found none. "You don't even know me," she said softly. "I could be anyone. I could be dangerous." Thomas chuckled, a sound that seemed to warm the cold air around them. "Elizabeth, I've been sizing up people in situations my whole life. You're about as dangerous as a wet kitten." Besides, he added, his expression growing more serious, "sometimes helping a stranger is exactly what we need to do, even if we don't understand why at the time." Elizabeth sat quietly for a long moment, weighing her options. Thomas could practically see the internal debate playing out, her desperate need for warmth, food, and human kindness against whatever had taught her to be so wary of accepting help. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Just for tonight," she said. "And if there's any trouble, any sign that someone's looking for me, I'll leave immediately. I won't bring danger to your door." "Fair enough," Thomas agreed, though privately he had no intention of letting this woman disappear back into the cold night without at least trying to help her with whatever she was running from. As Elizabeth gathered her few belongings and prepared to follow him out of the barn, Thomas found himself studying her face again in the beam of his flashlight. That nagging sense of familiarity was growing stronger, And with it came the beginning of a suspicion that would change everything he thought he knew about his quiet farming community. There had been a Warren family in Millbrook County years ago. He was sure of it now. But they had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and it had been so long that most people had forgotten they had ever existed at all. As Thomas led Elizabeth Warren across the frozen yard toward his farmhouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that Christmas Eve, 1987, was about to become a night that neither of them would ever forget. The snow was beginning to fall in earnest now, large flakes that caught the light from the kitchen window of Thomas's house and danced through the darkness like earthbound stars. Behind them, the old barn stood silent and empty once again, but the discovery made within its walls had already set in motion a chain of events that would ripple through the small farming community for years to come. The warmth of Thomas McKenna's kitchen hit Elizabeth Warren like a physical embrace as she stepped through the back door. After weeks of sleeping in cold cars, abandoned buildings, and now a drafty barn, the simple comfort of heated air felt almost overwhelming. She stood just inside the doorway, still clutching her worn backpack, taking in the homey details of the room that spoke of a life lived with care and purpose. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the old farmhouse. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface worn smooth by decades of use, and marked with the gentle scars that came from a lifetime of meal preparation and family gatherings. Copper pots hung from hooks above a well-used stove, and the walls were decorated with faded photographs, children's drawings that had been carefully preserved behind glass, and a collection of mismatched but cheerful dish towels. Thomas busied himself at the stove, stirring the pot of soup he had mentioned, and the aroma that filled the air was so rich and inviting that Elizabeth felt her knees go weak. It smelled like home, like safety, like all the things she had been running from for so long that she had almost forgotten they existed. "Sit down," Thomas said without turning around, gesturing toward one of the wooden chairs at the table. "You look ready to fall over." Elizabeth hesitated, still not entirely convinced that this wasn't some kind of trap or trick. In her experience, people didn't just invite strange women into their homes and offer them free meals, especially not when those women were clearly running from something. But the exhaustion in her bones was so complete, and the warmth of the kitchen so seductive, that she finally allowed herself to sink into the offered chair. Thomas ladled soup into a heavy ceramic bowl and placed it in front of her, along with a thick slice of homemade bread and a glass of cold milk. The soup was a hearty vegetable beef stew, filled with chunks of tender meat and fresh vegetables that had clearly been grown in someone's garden. Elizabeth tried to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity, but her body had other ideas. She found herself consuming the meal with an urgency that embarrassed her, barely pausing to breathe between bites. Thomas said nothing about her obvious hunger, instead pouring himself a cup of coffee and settling into the chair across from her. He waited patiently until she had finished the first bowl and accepted a second helping before finally breaking the comfortable silence. "So," he said gently, "want to tell me what brings you to Millbrook County on Christmas Eve?" Elizabeth paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. She had known this question was coming, had been preparing for it since she agreed to come into the house. The problem was that she wasn't sure how much of the truth she could safely share. Her story was complicated, dangerous, and involved people who had made it very clear that they didn't want certain information getting out. "It's a long story," she said finally, setting down her spoon and wrapping her hands around the warm bowl. "I've got time. And Elizabeth, I need you to understand something. I don't know what you're running from, but I can see that you're scared, really scared. Now, I'm not going to force you to tell me anything you don't want to, but if there's any way I can help, I'd like to try." Elizabeth looked into his kind, weathered face and felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the possibility of trust. There was something about Thomas McKenna that reminded her of her grandfather, who had died when she was 12. The same patience, the same quiet strength, the same way of making people feel safe just by being present.
"My name really is Elizabeth Warren," she began slowly.
"But I haven't lived in this area for 20 years. I grew up here, on a farm about 10 miles north of here, until I was 14. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. His suspicion had been correct. She was connected to the Warren family that had lived in the county decades ago. But the Warrens had left under circumstances that most people preferred not to discuss, and if Elizabeth had been 14 at the time, that would make the timing right for what he was beginning to remember. "The Warren place," he said carefully. "Up on Hickory Ridge Road." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. "You knew my family?" "I knew of them," Thomas said, "though I was younger then. and we didn't run in the same circles. Your father was Daniel Warren, right? And your mother was Margaret? Elizabeth nodded, and Thomas could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. You remember them. I remember when they left, Thomas said gently. There was talk around town, but no one ever really knew what happened. One day you were all just gone, and the property sat empty until the bank eventually sold it. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her soup. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. We didn't leave by choice, she said. We were forced out. My father had discovered something that certain people in this county didn't want getting out. When he wouldn't stay quiet about it, they made sure we had no choice but to disappear. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. What kind of something? Elizabeth shook her head. I was just a kid, so I didn't understand all of it at the time. But my father worked for the county tax assessor's office, and he had access to property records and financial documents. He found evidence that several prominent families in the area were involved in some kind of land scheme. They were buying up properties through shell companies, manipulating the tax assessments to drive down values, and then flipping the land for development. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. What Elizabeth was describing sounded like the kind of corruption that could reach into the highest levels of local government, the kind that people would kill to keep quiet. He tried to do the right thing, Elizabeth continued. He gathered evidence, made copies of documents, and took everything to the state attorney general's office. But somehow, the people involved found out what he was doing before any investigation could get started. What happened then? Thomas asked, though he was beginning to fear he already knew the answer. They started with threats, Elizabeth said, her voice growing stronger as she talked. Phone calls in the middle of the night warning my father to drop his investigation and keep his mouth shut. When that didn't work, they got more direct. Our barn burned down, and the sheriff ruled it an accident even though we all knew it was arson. Then our cattle got sick from something that was clearly poison, but the veterinarian said he couldn't determine the cause. Thomas felt his anger rising as he listened to Elizabeth's story. He remembered the Warren family now, remembered Daniel Warren as a quiet, honest man who had always seemed to take his responsibilities seriously. The idea that such a person would be driven from his home for trying to expose corruption made Thomas's blood boil. Finally, Elizabeth continued, my father got a visit from 3 men he didn't recognize. They made it clear that the next step would be directed at me and my mother, not just the property. They told him he had 24 hours to pack up his family and leave the county, and if he ever came back, or if he ever tried to resurrect his investigation, we would all disappear permanently. And your father believed them. My father was a smart man, Elizabeth said firmly. He knew that these weren't idle threats. So we left. We packed what we could fit in our car and drove away in the middle of the night, leaving everything else behind. Thomas sat back in his chair, processing what he had heard. The Warren family's sudden departure had been the subject of speculation for months after they left, but the truth was worse than any of the rumors that had circulated at the time. Where did you go? He asked. Florida, initially. My father had a cousin in Tampa who helped us get settled. Dad found work as a bookkeeper. Mum got a job in a grocery store, and I finished high school there. We changed our name to Walker and tried to start over. But you're back now, Thomas pointed out, and you're running from someone again. Elizabeth's expression darkened. About 6 months ago, my father passed away. Cancer. Before he died, he made me promise that I would come back here someday and try to finish what he started. He had kept copies of all the documents he had gathered, hidden them in a safe deposit box all these years. He wanted someone to finally hold those people accountable for what they did to our family, and who knows how many others. Thomas could see where this story was heading, and he didn't like it. So you came back to Millbrook County to continue his investigation. I tried to be smart about it, Elizabeth said defensively. I didn't use my real name when I rented an apartment in town. I got a job at the diner under my married name. I was married for a few years, but it didn't work out, and I started quietly looking into the families my father had identified in his documents. But someone recognized you. Elizabeth nodded grimly.
Weeks ago, someone left a note on my car.
It had my real name on it and a message that said I had 48 hours to leave town or I would end up like my father. Thomas felt his blood run cold. They threatened to kill you? The note said my father's cancer wasn't as natural as everyone thought, Elizabeth said, her voice shaking slightly. It said they had ways of dealing with people who didn't know when to stay quiet, and that they had been watching me since I arrived in town. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the sound of wind rattling the windows. Thomas stared at Elizabeth, trying to process the implications of what she had told him. If what she was saying was true, then there were people in his community who were not only capable of corruption on a massive scale, but who were willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. You believed them, he said finally. Wouldn't you? Elizabeth shot back. These people destroyed my family once already, and now they're telling me they may have killed my father. I wasn't going to stick around to see what they would do to me. Thomas couldn't argue with her logic. If even half of what Elizabeth had told him was true, then her caution was not only understandable, but necessary for her survival. So you've been living on the road for 3 weeks, he said. I've been trying to figure out what to do, Elizabeth corrected. Part of me wants to just keep running. Find somewhere safe to disappear and forget about all of this. But another part of me knows that my father was right. These people are still out there, still hurting people, and if I don't do something, no one will. Thomas looked at this brave, frightened woman sitting at his kitchen table and felt something stirring inside him that he hadn't experienced since his wife's death 5 years earlier. A sense of purpose that went beyond his daily routine of farming and solitude. Elizabeth, he said slowly, what if I told you that you might not have to face this alone? She looked up at him with a mixture of hope and wariness. What do you mean? I mean that you are not the only person in this county who's ever wondered about some of the people in positions of power around here. And you're certainly not the only one who thinks it's time someone started asking the hard questions. Elizabeth stared at him for a long moment. You would help me? Even though you barely know me? Even though it could be dangerous? Thomas stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the snow that was now falling steadily in the darkness. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and he had been planning to spend it alone, as he had for the past 5 years. But sometimes, he thought, Christmas brought gifts that you didn't expect and didn't know you needed. Elizabeth, he said, turning back to face her. Sometimes a man gets to an age where he starts thinking about the legacy he's going to leave behind. I've lived my whole life in this county, raised my children here, buried my wife here. If there are people who think they can corrupt this place and hurt innocent families without anyone standing up to them, then maybe it's time someone proved them wrong. As the snow continued to fall outside, Elizabeth Warren felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, the possibility that she might finally have found an ally in her fight for justice. And Thomas McKenna, looking at the determination growing in her bright blue eyes, realized that Christmas Eve 1987 was going to mark the beginning of something much bigger than either of them had ever imagined. Christmas morning dawned grey and cold, with a blanket of snow covering the rolling hills of Millbrook County. Thomas McKenna woke before sunrise, as was his habit, and for a moment lay still in his bed, wondering if the events of the previous evening had been some kind of vivid dream. But as the familiar sounds of his old house settling around him brought him fully awake, he remembered the woman sleeping in his guest room and the story she had told him about corruption, threats, and a family driven from their home 20 years ago. Thomas dressed quietly and made his way downstairs to start coffee. As he moved through his morning routine, he found himself thinking about the implications of what Elizabeth Warren had shared with him. If her father's documents were authentic, and if the corruption he had uncovered was still ongoing, then the roots of the problem likely ran deeper than anyone in the community realized. He was stirring cream into his second cup of coffee when Elizabeth appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had clearly slept poorly, dark circles shadowing her bright blue eyes, and she moved with the cautious alertness of someone who had spent too many nights unsure of her safety. Good morning, Thomas said gently. How did you sleep? Better than I have in weeks, Elizabeth admitted, settling into the same chair she had occupied the night before. I can't remember the last time I felt safe enough to really sleep. Thomas poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her, along with a plate of eggs and toast he had prepared. Well, you're safe here as long as you need to be. But I've been thinking about what you told me last night, and I think we need to talk about what comes next. Elizabeth wrapped her hands around the warm coffee mug, using it to steady herself, as much as to ward off the cold. I've been thinking about that too. I need to leave, Thomas. I shouldn't have involved you in this at all. These people are dangerous, and they've been getting away with whatever they're doing for 20 years because everyone who might stand up to them either gets scared off or disappears. Thomas interrupted firmly. Elizabeth, running away isn't going to solve anything. They'll still be here, still hurting people, still thinking they can do whatever they want without consequences. Elizabeth stared at him across the table. You don't understand what you're saying. These aren't just local bullies or corrupt officials. My father's documents show connections to people in the state government, possibly even federal level. The land schemes he uncovered involved millions of dollars and some very powerful families. Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering this information. Then maybe it's time someone with connections of their own got involved. What do you mean? I mean that I wasn't always just a farmer, Thomas said. Before I inherited this place from my father, I spent 15 years working for the Pennsylvania State Police. I retired early when my dad got sick, but I still have friends in law enforcement. Good friends who know how to handle complicated situations and who can be trusted to do the right thing. Elizabeth's eyes widened. You were a state trooper? Detective, actually. I worked fraud and corruption cases for the last 5 years of my career. So when you describe land schemes and document manipulation, I understand exactly what you're talking about and how serious it is. For the first time since Thomas had found her in his barn, Elizabeth looked genuinely hopeful. You think your friends would be willing to look at my father's evidence? I think they would be very interested in it, Thomas said. But first, I need to see what we're dealing with. Do you still have access to those documents your father collected? Elizabeth nodded. They're in a safe deposit box in Philadelphia. I have the key, but I was afraid to go back there because I thought they might be watching for me. Thomas stood up from the table and walked to an old wooden cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. From one of the drawers, he pulled out a road map of Pennsylvania and spread it across the table. Philadelphia is about 2 hours from here, he said, tracing the route with his finger. If we left early enough, we could drive down, get the documents, and be back before dark. But we'd need to be careful about it. Elizabeth studied the map, her mind clearly working through the possibilities and risks. They might be watching the bank. They might be, Thomas agreed. But they're probably not expecting you to show up on Christmas Day with a 62-year-old retired cop. Sometimes the best way to do something dangerous is to do it when people aren't expecting it. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map and weighing her options. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out across her face, her desire to finally take action against the people who had destroyed her family, warring with her very reasonable fear of the consequences. If we do this, she said finally, and if your friends agree to investigate, there's no going back. Once we start down this path, we'll have to see it through to the end, no matter what we find or who gets hurt. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Elizabeth, I've been living in this county for my entire life. If there are people here who think they can intimidate families, manipulate government records, and possibly even commit murder, then I want them stopped. Not just for your family's sake, but for everyone who's been hurt by them and everyone who might be hurt in the future. Elizabeth nodded slowly, and Thomas could see her father's determination emerging in her expression. Then we do this. Today. But I want to understand exactly what we're walking into first. Thomas returned to the cabinet and pulled out a thick folder that he placed on the table beside the map. Last night, after you went to bed, I did some thinking about what you told me. I went through my old files and pulled out everything I could find about unusual property transactions and county government activities over the past 20 years. Elizabeth opened the folder and began examining the documents inside. Thomas had collected newspaper clippings, public records, and notes from conversations with other farmers and business owners in the area. As she read through the material, her expression grew increasingly grim. This is more extensive than I thought, she said. Look at this. Between 1985 and 1990, over 40 family farms were sold to development companies at below market prices, and most of those sales happened after the families experienced some kind of financial crisis or property damage. Thomas pointed to a list of names he had compiled. And notice how many of the same people keep showing up as buyers, sellers, or intermediaries in these transactions. There's definitely a pattern here. Elizabeth studied the names, comparing them to notes she pulled from her own small notebook. 3 of these families are specifically mentioned in my father's documents: the Hendersons, the Blackwoods, and the Carmichaels. According to Dad's research, they were the primary beneficiaries of the land manipulation scheme. Thomas felt a chill as he read those names. All 3 families were prominent in Millbrook County, holding positions in local government, sitting on various boards and committees, and generally considered pillars of the community. The idea that they might be involved in systematic corruption was disturbing, but the evidence was becoming harder to ignore. There's something else, Elizabeth said, pulling a faded photograph from her notebook. This was taken at a county planning meeting in 1986, about a year before my family was forced to leave. My father managed to get a copy, because he wanted to document who was present when certain zoning decisions were made. Thomas examined the black and white photograph, which showed a room full of men in suits gathered around a large table covered with maps and documents. In the center of the group, he recognized the faces of Harold Henderson, William Blackwood, and James Carmichael, all looking much younger but clearly the same people who continued to wield influence in the county today. The man standing behind Carmichael, Elizabeth said, pointing to a figure partially obscured by shadows, is Sheriff Robert Dalton. And the person next to him is County Commissioner Patricia Mills. According to my father's notes, both of them were receiving payments from the three families in exchange for their cooperation in the land scheme. Thomas stared at the photograph, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Sheriff Dalton was still in office, now in his third decade of serving Millbrook County. Commissioner Mills had died in a car accident in 1992, which at the time had seemed like a tragic coincidence, but now took on more sinister implications.
Elizabeth, Thomas said slowly.
If your father was right about all of this, then we're not just talking about corruption from 20 years ago. We're talking about a network of people who are still in positions of power today. Elizabeth nodded grimly.
That's exactly why they were so threatened when I came back.
They thought this was all buried in the past, and suddenly here I am, digging it all up again. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that had been his home for his entire life. Somewhere out there, if Elizabeth's story was true, were people who had built their wealth and influence on a foundation of fraud, intimidation, and possibly worse. The thought that such corruption could exist in his quiet farming community was both heartbreaking and infuriating. We need those documents, he said, turning back to face Elizabeth. Whatever evidence your father collected, it's the key to proving everything you've told me. But we also need to be smart about how we handle this. Elizabeth closed her notebook and met his gaze. What do you have in mind? Thomas returned to the table and began folding up the map. First, we drive to Philadelphia and get those documents. Then we bring them back here and go through everything carefully, making sure we understand exactly what we're dealing with. After that, I contact my friends in law enforcement and we turn the whole thing over to people who have the authority to do something about it. And if the corruption goes as high as my father suspected, what if some of your law enforcement friends are involved too? Thomas had considered this possibility, and he had to admit it was a real concern. Corruption that had persisted for decades often had tentacles reaching into unexpected places. But he also knew that there were still honest cops and investigators who could be trusted to do the right thing, even when it was difficult or dangerous. Then we keep looking until we find someone we can trust, he said simply. Elizabeth, your father started this fight because he believed in doing what was right, even when it cost him everything. The least we can do is see it through. Elizabeth stood up from the table and Thomas could see her father's courage shining in her bright blue eyes. Then, let's go get those documents. As they prepared to leave for Philadelphia, neither Thomas nor Elizabeth could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead. The corruption they were about to expose went deeper than either of them imagined, and the people responsible for it would prove more dangerous than they had anticipated. But on that Christmas morning in 1987, as snow continued to fall across Millbrook County, two unlikely allies were taking the first steps toward uncovering a truth that had been buried for too long. The drive to Philadelphia would take them through small towns and rural areas that looked peaceful and innocent beneath their blanket of snow. But beneath that serene surface, a network of corruption and intimidation had been operating for decades, and the time had finally come for someone to shine a light into the darkness. As Thomas's pickup truck disappeared into the grey morning, heading southeast toward the city, the old farmhouse stood quiet and empty behind them, but the kitchen table still bore the evidence of their planning session. Maps, documents, and photographs that told a story of greed and power that had shaped their community in ways most people never suspected. By evening, that evidence would be joined by a collection of documents that would change everything, setting in motion events that would rock Millbrook County to its very foundations. The drive to Philadelphia took Thomas and Elizabeth through a landscape transformed by snow, where familiar landmarks became mysterious and new under their white covering. They drove mostly in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might find in the safe deposit box and what it would mean for their quiet farming community. The First National Bank of Philadelphia was closed for Christmas Day, as Elizabeth had expected, but she had called ahead and arranged for emergency access through a contact her father had cultivated during his years of exile. Marcus Webb, the bank's security chief, met them at a side entrance and escorted them through empty corridors that echoed with their footsteps. Your father was a good man, Marcus told Elizabeth as he led them to the vault area. He helped my family when we had some legal troubles years ago. Never asked for anything in return. I was sorry to hear about his passing. Elizabeth nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Even in exile, her father had continued to help people, never letting bitterness over what had happened to his family turn him away from doing what was right. The safe deposit box was larger than Thomas had expected, and when Elizabeth opened it with trembling hands, they found it packed with manila folders, photographs, and what appeared to be copies of official documents. Elizabeth pulled everything out carefully, stacking the materials on the small table in the viewing room. "There's so much more than I remembered," she whispered, staring at the mountain of evidence her father had accumulated. Thomas picked up the first folder and opened it, revealing a detailed timeline of property acquisitions in Millbrook County dating back to 1983. Each entry included the original owner, the selling price, the purchasing entity, and notes about circumstances surrounding the sale. As Thomas read through the entries, a clear pattern emerged that was even more disturbing than what Elizabeth had described. "Your father was methodical," Thomas said admiringly. "Look at this. He didn't just document the suspicious sales. He tracked what happened to the families afterward. Most of them left the county entirely, and several experienced additional financial problems or accidents after their properties were sold." Elizabeth opened another folder, this one containing photographs and photocopied documents from county offices. "These are records that should have been public but somehow became difficult to access. Dad made copies before they could be buried or destroyed." Among the documents were tax assessments that had been mysteriously lowered just before properties changed hands, zoning variances that had been approved without proper hearings, and environmental reports that had been altered to hide potential problems with certain pieces of land. The level of systematic manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Thomas found himself growing angrier as he read through more of the evidence. These weren't isolated incidents of small-town corruption. This was a carefully orchestrated scheme that had displaced dozens of families and stolen millions of dollars in property value over the course of several years. "Elizabeth, look at this," Thomas said, holding up a document that made his blood run cold. "This is a list of what your father called problem families, people who asked too many questions or resisted pressure to sell their properties." Elizabeth leaned over to read the list, and her face went pale. The Kowalskis, the Brennans, the Washingtons, I remember some of these names. These were families who had accidents or fires or other problems that forced them to sell. "And look at the notes in the margins," Thomas pointed out. "Your father documented what happened to each family after they were identified as problems. The Kowalskis had their barn burned down 2 weeks after they refused an offer on their property. The Brennans lost half their cattle to a mysterious illness. The Washingtons had their water well contaminated." Elizabeth sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the evidence of systematic intimidation and destruction. "My father tried to save all of these people, and no one would listen to him." Thomas continued reading through the documents, and what he found next made him understand why Elizabeth's family had been forced to flee the county. In a folder marked Key Players, Daniel Warren had compiled detailed profiles of everyone involved in the conspiracy, including photographs, financial records, and documented connections between the various participants. Harold Henderson, the folder revealed, was not just a wealthy landowner, but also a silent partner in several development companies that had purchased the undervalued properties. William Blackwood had used his position on the County Planning Commission to manipulate zoning decisions in favor of his associates. James Carmichael had leveraged his role as a county tax assessor to artificially lower property values for targeted families. But the most disturbing discovery was a document that Thomas found at the bottom of one folder, a handwritten note from Sheriff Robert Dalton to Harold Henderson, dated just 2 weeks before the Warren family disappeared from Millbrook County. "Daniel Warren is becoming a serious problem," the note read. "My sources tell me he's gathered enough evidence to cause real trouble for all of us. I recommend we move to phase 2 of our contingency plan immediately. The family needs to be neutralized before Warren can take his evidence to state authorities." Thomas felt his hands shaking as he read the note. "Elizabeth, you need to see this." Elizabeth took the document from Thomas and read it twice, before looking up at him with eyes wide with shock and fear. "Phase 2. What do you think that meant?" Thomas's law enforcement experience gave him a pretty good idea, but he didn't want to voice his suspicions aloud. Instead, he continued searching through the documents until he found what he was looking for, another handwritten note, this one apparently copied from Henderson's personal files. "Phase 2 protocol is in effect," the second note read. "Family has been given ultimatum and encouraged to relocate immediately. If they refuse to cooperate, move to Phase 3. Eliminate the problem permanently and make it look accidental." The small room fell silent except for the sound of their breathing. Thomas and Elizabeth stared at each other across the table, both understanding the implications of what they had just read. The conspiracy hadn't just involved fraud and intimidation, it had been prepared to commit murder to protect itself. "They were going to kill us," Elizabeth whispered. "If my father hadn't agreed to leave when he did, they would have murdered my entire family." Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "But he was smart enough to get you out before that happened. And now, 20 years later, we have the evidence to make sure they finally face justice." Elizabeth wiped away tears that had started flowing down her cheeks. "Thomas, look at this last folder. It's labeled Current Activities 1987. Thomas opened the final folder and found documents suggesting that the conspiracy had not ended when the Warren family left town. Instead, it had evolved and expanded. There were records of continued property manipulations, evidence of bid rigging on county construction projects, and what appeared to be a systematic effort to control local elections through intimidation and vote buying. "This is still going on," Thomas said, his voice tight with anger. "They didn't stop after they got rid of your family. They just got more careful about covering their tracks." Elizabeth stood up and began pacing the small room. "So what do we do now? We have all this evidence, but some of these people are still in positions of power. Sheriff Dalton is still the sheriff. Henderson, Blackwood, and Carmichael are still prominent citizens. How do we make sure they can't just cover this up again?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking through their options. His law enforcement contacts would be crucial, but they would need to be very careful about who they approached and how they presented the evidence. "We make copies of everything," he said finally. "Multiple copies, stored in different places. Then we take the evidence to people outside of Millbrook County, state authorities who have no connection to the local power structure." "What about your friends in law enforcement?" "I'm going to call Detective Mike Sullivan at the State Police Headquarters in Harrisburg. Mike and I worked together for years, and I trust him completely. He specializes in public corruption cases, and he has the authority to launch a full investigation without having to go through local channels." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since she had started reading her father's documents. "When do we call him?" Thomas checked his watch. "Tomorrow morning. Today is Christmas, and Mike will be with his family. But first thing tomorrow, we'll drive to Harrisburg and present everything in person. That way we can be sure the evidence gets into the right hands." They spent the next 2 hours carefully organizing and copying all of Daniel Warren's documents. Marcus Webb, the security chief, helped them use the bank's copying machines and provided additional storage boxes to keep the materials organized. By the time they finished, they had 3 complete sets of evidence, one to give to Detective Sullivan, one to store in a different safe deposit box, and one to keep with them for reference. As they prepared to leave Philadelphia, Elizabeth turned to Thomas with an expression of gratitude and determination that reminded him strongly of her father. "Thomas, I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope that justice might actually be possible." Thomas smiled at her as they walked back toward his truck. "Elizabeth, your father was a brave man who tried to do the right thing under impossible circumstances. The least we can do is finish what he started." The drive back to Millbrook County took place mostly in darkness, with their headlights cutting through the falling snow and illuminating a world that looked peaceful and innocent. But both Thomas and Elizabeth knew that beneath the surface of their quiet farming community, a network of corruption had been operating for decades, destroying families and manipulating the democratic process for personal gain. As they neared Thomas's farmhouse, Elizabeth realized that their investigation was entering a new phase. Tomorrow they would present Daniel Warren's evidence to law enforcement authorities who had the power to act on it. But they both understood that once they took that step, there would be no turning back. The people they were accusing would fight back with everything they had, and the battle for justice in Millbrook County was just beginning. Thomas parked his truck in front of the old farmhouse, and they carried their boxes of evidence inside. As they sat at the kitchen table one more time, organizing their materials and preparing for the next day's journey to Harrisburg, neither of them noticed the dark sedan that had been following them at a distance since they left Philadelphia. In the shadows at the edge of Thomas's property, someone was taking photographs of his house and making notes about the visitors he was harboring. The network of corruption that Daniel Warren had tried to expose 20 years earlier was still very much alive, and it had no intention of allowing his daughter to succeed where he had been forced to fail. But Thomas McKenna was not Daniel Warren, and Elizabeth Warren was no longer the frightened 14-year-old who had been forced to flee her home in the middle of the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers, but for the first time in 20 years, the truth about Millbrook County was finally going to see the light of day. The morning of December 26th dawned clear and cold, with brilliant sunshine reflecting off the fresh snow that covered Millbrook County like a pristine blanket. Thomas McKenna was awake before sunrise, his mind too active with thoughts of the day ahead to allow for more sleep. Today they would take Daniel Warren's evidence to Detective Mike Sullivan in Harrisburg, and if everything went according to plan, they would finally set in motion the wheels of justice that had been denied for 20 years. Elizabeth was already awake when Thomas knocked gently on her bedroom door, and she emerged dressed and ready for what they both knew would be one of the most important days of their lives. Over breakfast, they reviewed their strategy one more time, organizing the evidence into a logical sequence that would tell the story clearly and convincingly. "Are you nervous?" Thomas asked as they prepared to leave for Harrisburg. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "Yes, but not the way I've been nervous for the past few weeks. This is different. This is the kind of nervousness that comes from finally having hope." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. For weeks, Elizabeth had been running from shadows, never sure who she could trust or where she might find safety. Now, for the first time, she was moving towards something instead of away from it. They loaded the boxes of evidence into Thomas's pickup truck and set out for Harrisburg, a drive that would take them about an hour and a half through the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. As they drove, Elizabeth found herself looking at the landscape with new eyes, seeing not just the beauty of the snow-covered fields and forests, but also the history of the families who had worked this land for generations, some of whom had been driven away by the very corruption they were now trying to expose. Detective Mike Sullivan met them at the Pennsylvania State Police headquarters, a modern building that stood in stark contrast to the historic streets of Harrisburg. Sullivan was a compact, energetic man in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Thomas had called him the night before to arrange the meeting, and Sullivan had agreed to see them despite the holiday. "Thomas, it's good to see you again," Sullivan said, shaking his former colleague's hand warmly. "Though I have to admit, the case you described over the phone sounds like it could be complicated." "Mike, I'd like you to meet Elizabeth Warren," Thomas said. "She's the daughter of Daniel Warren, the man whose evidence we're bringing you today." Sullivan shook Elizabeth's hand and studied her face with the practiced gaze of an experienced investigator. "Ms. Warren, Thomas tells me you've been having some trouble in Millbrook County. Why don't you tell me your story from the beginning?" They spent the next 3 hours in Sullivan's office, methodically presenting Daniel Warren's evidence and explaining the events that had led to Elizabeth's return to Pennsylvania. Sullivan listened without interruption, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated his thorough understanding of corruption investigations. When they finished their presentation, Sullivan leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had heard and seen. "This is substantial," he said finally. "If even half of what's in these documents is accurate, we're looking at a conspiracy that involves multiple felonies spanning several decades. The problem is that most of the evidence is 20 years old, which presents some challenges from a legal standpoint." Elizabeth felt her heart sink. "Does that mean you can't do anything?" Sullivan held up a hand. "I didn't say that. What I said is that it presents challenges, not that it's impossible. The key is that, according to your father's documents, this conspiracy was still active as of 1987, and you've presented evidence suggesting it may still be ongoing today." Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "What would you need to open a formal investigation?" "Current evidence," Sullivan said without hesitation. "If we can demonstrate that the same people are still engaged in similar activities today, then the statute of limitations becomes less of an issue. We would be investigating ongoing criminal activity rather than trying to prosecute crimes that happened decades ago." Elizabeth and Thomas exchanged glances. They had suspected that the corruption might still be continuing, but they hadn't gathered any current evidence to prove it. "How would we go about finding current evidence?" Elizabeth asked. Sullivan smiled for the first time since they had arrived. "Very carefully and with proper law enforcement oversight. Warren, if you're willing to work with us, I think we can set up a controlled investigation that would allow us to gather the evidence we need while keeping you safe." Elizabeth felt a flutter of fear mixed with excitement. "What would that involve?" "You would return to Millbrook County under our protection and supervision," Sullivan explained. "We would provide you with recording equipment and other investigative tools, and you would attempt to make contact with some of the people mentioned in your father's documents. The goal would be to get them talking about their current activities, ideally on tape." Thomas frowned.
"Mike, that sounds extremely dangerous."
"These people have already threatened Elizabeth once, and they may have been responsible for her father's death." Sullivan nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, Thomas. It would be dangerous, which is why we would have undercover agents monitoring Elizabeth's activities at all times. She would never be alone or unprotected. Elizabeth was quiet for several minutes, weighing the risks and benefits of Sullivan's proposal. The idea of deliberately putting herself in danger was terrifying, but it might be the only way to finally bring her father's killers to justice. If I agreed to do this, she said slowly, how long would it take? Probably several weeks, maybe a couple of months, Sullivan replied. We would need time to set up the operation properly, get you established in the community again, and create opportunities for you to interact with the targets of the investigation. Elizabeth looked at Thomas, seeking his advice. Thomas studied her face, seeing both her fear and her determination. Elizabeth, the decision has to be yours, he said gently. But whatever you decide, you won't be facing it alone. If you choose to do this, I'll be there to help in whatever way I can. Elizabeth nodded, and when she spoke, her voice was strong and clear. Detective Sullivan, I want to do this. My father spent the last 20 years of his life knowing that the people who destroyed our family were still out there, still hurting others. If there's a chance to stop them, I have to take it. Sullivan smiled approvingly. I was hoping you'd say that. But I need you to understand that once we start this operation, you'll be committed to seeing it through to the end, regardless of what we discover or how dangerous it becomes. I understand, Elizabeth said firmly. Sullivan spent the rest of their meeting outlining the preliminary steps for the investigation. Elizabeth would need to establish a legitimate reason for returning to Millbrook County, perhaps a job or a rental property. She would be equipped with sophisticated recording equipment and would receive training in investigative techniques. Most importantly, she would be backed by a team of experienced undercover agents who would monitor her safety at all times. As they prepared to leave Harrisburg, Sullivan shook hands with both Thomas and Elizabeth. This is important work you're doing, he told them.